core for the peeps that aren't here. So I thought I could just do a little short talk on giving kind of little cliff notes on macronutrients and micronutrients, and just give a little extra info about why we're focusing on them, why they're important, and then if any questions come up, now's a great time to chat. And before we clicked record, it was really nice to hear your different wins, and even just so you get to see that there's like other people on the journey too, and no one's in it alone, and you get to, so feel free to use this community too to like chat and share your obstacles and wins, so then people can help comment and motivate and all that jazz. But so on the topic for today, I wanted to talk about macronutrients, micronutrients. Those like terms are thrown around a lot. And so what it means is like nutrients are these essential components that are necessary for us to get from our diet to survive, because our body needs it, but our body can't make these things on its own. So that's why we need to consume it through our diet. And the difference between macro and micro, that just means macronutrients are the nutrients that the body needs in macro quantities, in large quantities, and micronutrients just means it's the nutrients the body needs in smaller quantities. So macros are like those bigger categories of proteins, carbs, and fats. The reason it can get a little confusing when explaining things is because lots of foods have all of these different macronutrients in them, because like a carbohydrate just means there's this molecule of like carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. It's like that's just the chemical makeup of it. So different foods have proteins and carbs and fats in it. Like an avocado has all of those things in it. We just put them in specific categories to make it easier for our brain to be like, okay, this is what it has the highest ratio of. So that's why it tends to get confusing when people are like, oh, but I thought, so they're like, well, no, but I heard like cheese or peanut butter is a protein. And the gray area there is like, okay, there is protein, carbs, and fats in those things. There's a higher quantity of fats. So omnivores, people who are eating everything, to keep it simple for us, we put it in the category of fats because the molecule, the makeup of it is a higher ratio of fats. So we're like, oh, that's like a dense source of fat. It doesn't mean it's only made up of fatty acids. It just means that it's a higher ratio of fatty acids in its structure. The reason why we will sometimes call it a protein source is because, say someone is vegetarian or vegan, they don't eat animal proteins, which are classified as really protein dense foods. So when we look at the plant food kingdom, things like beans and legumes, so peanut butter, stuff like that, or if they're vegetarian but not vegan, cheese, that stuff in the food that they're able to eat, they classify it as their protein source because it has the higher ratio of proteins in the things that they're allowed to eat. So that's why sometimes people are like, oh, but I thought, I put peanut butter on it, like, doesn't that count as the protein source? If you weren't an omnivore, we could count that as one of the more protein dense foods, but whenever we have the availability of having foods that are even more dense in protein, that's why we put it in its other category where it's actually higher in fats. Same with beans. When you're a vegetarian, we would classify beans as like, okay, well, that has a higher ratio of beans. So like, we'll put that as in the protein column for you and try to have you include it more. And it counts kind of as a protein source. Whenever you're eating animal foods, which are the ratio of protein is way higher, we put beans as a carbohydrate source because the carbohydrate content is bigger. It does have protein in it. It's just not super high ratio compared to all the other foods that we have available to us. If that kind of gives a little clarity, just give a little thumbs up, or if that kind of makes a little sense, yeah, perfect. So that's kind of talking about protein. And so there's healthy fats and carbs. The reason why I like to focus with most of you here with having protein as the priority to kind of focus on, and then plants, is because for a few different reasons. Protein is super helpful for the body because it's essential to so many things. But also when we're focusing on our health, it's it's super satiating. Like, you know, when you eat something that's high in protein, you feel really full longer. It digests slower. So when you're eating it along with other things, it slows the release of glucose. So you're not having these like spikes and falls of your blood sugar. So that reduces cravings and that reduces like thoughts around food because you're not hungry all the time. So anytime you're making kind of health changes, it's a really good one to focus on. Um, it also is like super nutrient dense with it, which is helpful. So it helps us maintain like makes it easier to find what our healthy physical body weight is because it gives us cues of when we've had enough. That's when pushing towards whole foods is really helpful because we have to worry less about like, okay, how do we tell how much is too much? Do I have to count calories or count macros or do I have to weigh things? When we're pushing our diet towards mainly whole foods, our body is built to kind of have those intrinsic signals to let us know, like, okay, like you're full now, you'll feel full, your brain will stop thinking about food, food will kind of lose its allure, really. But so when we're mostly eating whole foods, you recognize, like, oh, you can, it's easier to naturally manage what's your healthiest, like, caloric intake just by way of like you eat when you're hungry and you stop when you're full. It starts to get harder to figure out what your proper like calorie intake is whenever there's a lot of added refined foods and processed foods because they've been manipulated a bit. So then our body doesn't have the same type of signaling to tell you when you've had enough because it doesn't physically fill you up. Because during the processing, they've removed fiber, they've removed water. So it's very like physically small. So then you don't get any of those like stretch receptors on your stomach to tell your brain that, oh, okay, we're full now, and they're really calorie dense because they've been processed and all the other things have been removed. So it's very easy to overeat on those kinds of foods past the energy intake that your body needs because you're not having those natural signals. So that is one reason why we focus on higher protein foods for kind of a multitude of reasons. And then I focus on plants because all those different colors, the fruits and veggies, that counts for that has a really high ratio of like all these micronutrients. So the nutrients the body needs just in smaller quantity, vitamin A, vitamin C, all these things. Um, so whenever we get a wide variety of different colors, that means we're getting a wide variety of different plants. That's another awesome thing that nature has done. So instead of feeling like we have to plug everything into an app or like weigh and measure, we can just look at our plate and like you can kind of tell when you look at more processed foods, unless it's like Skittles or something, but it'll all be kind of like beige and not super colorful or crazy textures and stuff. So it's just a little bit more limit in the nutrients it has. But whenever you're getting a wide variety of whole foods and your plate looks like a rainbow, that's an easy way to check off that you've had a wide variety of different vitamins and minerals. Another reason why we put a heavy focus on plants is it it physically fills you up because there's fiber and water in it, so that will help you get back in tune with what is enough for your body because it's physically actually filling you and you can get that fullness signal. um, because it also requires you to chew. Have you ever noticed if you're like eating a plate of whole foods, you're like, oh, my jaw's almost tired. Like chewing is, it literally takes some time. And that's super important for our health on many levels because it forces us to slow down. Actually, chewing our food tells the brain that food's coming in to start preparing your body to send all the digestive enzymes to prepare your stomach to start absorbing nutrients. So we kind of need that time and space so the body can do all the magical work that it's doing. Oftentimes, um, more of the processed and refined foods, they're built to almost melt on your tongue. They've kind of built that way. It's called like a little disappearing effect because it almost feels like it's there and then it's gone, and then your brain's like, I need more because I didn't actually get any yet because there's no like not actually substantial, like we only took like 2 bites and then it somehow like magically disappeared on our tongue. So they're kind of built that way because they're wanting wanting you to be consuming more. So that's another reason why plants are one of the big focuses, especially at the start. And then the other, they don't really classify it as a macronutrient, but some people do call it the fourth macronutrient because our body does need it in bigger quantities, and that is fiber, which we also get through focusing on getting in more plants. And fiber is super key to include because that is the fuel for our gut bugs. That is what our gut bugs eat, and they do hundreds of jobs for us. They produce serotonin, that little happy hormone. They protect the lining of our intestines. They help us manage blood sugar control. Fiber just helps them do their job. They're really important for your immunity, for digestion, moving all the toxins out of your body. So that is kind of why we start by focusing on proteins and plants, so we can get that fiber, the micronutrients. And then with fats, the other macronutrient, it's also something essential. We need it to live. The only reason it's not like I just try to make things easy, so we focus on just a couple things. And fat, we tend to naturally include just in way of like flavor and preparing foods, frying up veggies, adding dressings to salads. So it's something that kind of happens naturally. When we start to include more whole foods, we tend to naturally include more healthy fats. Just as a side note, if ever, extra virgin olive oil is a really great healthy fat. If ever you're nervous that you're like putting too much salad dressing on, but it's an extra virgin olive oil based one, in the Mediterranean diet, they'll consume up to like a liter of extra virgin olive oil a week. So you're fine. It's not, yeah, it's not an overabundance of extra virgin olive oil that's causing health concerns. It's that I think a lot of what happens is we're so worried about doing everything perfect and we hyper focus about all the little details, then it gets overwhelming and we're like, F this. And then we try to comfort that discomfort with those foods that kind of light up the dopamine and that feel very good in our mouth, the processed foods that give a hit of energy. So that would just be my reminder to be like, don't stress about perfect. Don't like worry about all these nitty gritty details. Just try to push most of your diet towards whole foods. It doesn't have to be perfect. There is totally room for foods for fun and flavor. When we're not stressing about it so much, we get to pause and tune into what actually feels good with our body. We'll recognize it's mostly a wide variety of whole foods with other stuff in there for fun and social connection. But just a reminder, it doesn't have to. Don't worry about things being perfect. Just shift towards more whole foods. Stop when you're satisfied and you'll be going in the right direction. So that's protein, the micros, fats, and then carbs. This is the one I think that gets a lot of confusion because carbs gets lumped all in under the same umbrella. Because remember, carbohydrate just means like a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is in part of it's together in the molecule. So because carbs, the umbrella, it can be that beans are carbs, vegetables, breads, pastas, whole grains, all those stuff are carbohydrates, but they can also be broken down into different subcategories of like, okay, there's the starchy carbohydrates that are whole food carb sources, but starchy carbs just mean that they're like, there's more of those carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. There's more of those connected together in like longer chains. So it's more energy dense. So those are like your whole grains and your potatoes and root vegetables and stuff like that. And then there's low starch, high fiber vegetables. So those are like your peppers and your broccolis and onions and mushrooms and all those more like higher volume, lower calorie foods that are really helpful. If you're someone who like likes to eat bigger volumes, those foods help physically fill you up with also managing your energy intake. The starchy carbs, there's totally room for those in the diet too. If we were eating, they also have nutrients in them. So that's why I don't love totally cutting out food groups because they're more energy dense. So it's good to be aware that they pack a lot of energy, but like that's good. Our body needs energy, and it also has fiber, and it also has nutrients. Whole food carb sources are also what's not like causing all of our health issues. It's that we're worried about eating a potato and then we stress about it. So then we go, I don't know what to eat for dinner, whatever. Now I'm too hungry. And then we go through the drive-through and eat the foods that make us feel yucky. So just knowing that those foods are more energy dense doesn't mean avoid them. It just means know that's how they are. And if we were just eating whole foods, they wouldn't be throwing you over your calorie intake, because you'd also have the signals of like, oh, I'm full. That meal was really satiating. Like you probably notice the difference between having meat, like meat and just the non-starchy vegetables. You're like, don't super feel satisfied sometimes. So then you're thinking about food all the time, and then you end up eating again and again after trying to like quench that like feeling full and satisfied. Sometimes an easy fix is like add some potatoes in there, and you'll be hungry, like you'll be full and satisfied for hours, and you won't be thinking about food the whole time. So yeah, they serve their place, especially if you're an athlete. You don't want to be getting rid of those good quality sources of nutrients, fiber, and energy, because we need energy to refuel and replenish and recover, especially post exercise. Like if we're getting into the nitty gritty details with these whole food carbohydrate sources, after exercise is a great time to include them, because that's when your muscles are just like looking to refuel with glucose that comes from those starchy carbs. So if you feel like getting fancy with it, that's a great time to include whole food starches. And then the other carb sources that are probably what are throwing us for a loop is those refined carbohydrate sources, because they've had all of the nutrients kind of removed, and they're super calorie dense, which just makes them really easy to overeat, which doesn't mean you can't have them and have to cut them out. It's just having an awareness of how these things impact our body, so you can be conscientious of going like, okay, I know these things are easy to overeat. I'm not going to feel physically full. So knowing that that's what they do, you can make choices around it. Like, okay, after a meal, I can, have a smaller portion and enjoy it and savor it. And knowing that when you include those things when you're not starving, it's really helpful, because you know that they don't physically fill you up. So when we're super hangry and then try to choose a more refined option to feel physically full off of that source, we're going to have to eat a lot of it, which by the time it ends up making us physically full, we've like gone way past what our body actually needs in energy wise. So that's kind of a little bit of a breakdown of the different macros and different micros. A lot of random information, but I just wanted to give a little bit more info on all of these different things. So even because sometimes, that people be like, okay, any questions? You're like, I don't even know what to be asking questions about. It's like, first, we just need to get a base of like information to spark our curiosity. And then as you start to experiment with stuff, then you'll have an idea of what questions to ask. But usually it boils down to like, okay, so there's all this information. What am I supposed to eat? And so we just simplify it and go, all right, so these are the things that my body needs. So we want to include protein, carbs, fats, and micronutrients and fiber. And so an easy way to try to check that off is trying to add all those things to most of your meals. So when you're building your meals, you can look at it and go like, okay, do I have one of those higher protein sources of food? Do I have a whole food carbohydrate, or one of those, like, depending on what your body needs? Okay, here, I'm going to break it down better. Okay, there's too much information that I want in your brains. Start with the protein source and fibers and those micronutrients, so like veggies, those colorful plants, and your healthy fats. Use those as kind of your foundation, the stars of the meal that you really want to get in, because they're like the essential nutrients. And then with the carbohydrates, depending on what your lifestyle is, you get to choose what style of, like, how often you want to add those into your meal. Say you have an active lifestyle, or the majority of what you're eating is whole foods, then include a whole food carb source at like every meal. Say you have goals where you're like, okay, my body has enough stored energy that I'm trying to shed. All right, well, if whole food carbohydrate sources are a bit more energy dense, then we'll include them at 1 or 2 of our meals, or just one of our meals during the day. Or if we're wanting to include a refined carbohydrate source, but we still want to make sure that we're getting a balanced amount of what our body needs, then we can make little adjustments like, okay, well, instead of having the whole food carb source, I'll stick to my healthy fats and fibers and proteins, and then have my refined carb source as my dessert afterwards. So then you're still, instead of it being like an overload of everything, you can kind of adjust things so your body's getting what it needs. Now, with all that random information, do you guys have questions to like give a little extra clarity so you feel confident like making your way around building plates and checking off the boxes of what your body needs?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot about protein and how if you're really active, increasing protein or hitting X amount of protein is needed for muscle gains.
Mhm.
With what you're saying and looking at the balance plate and just kind of intuitive listening to my body, would that still provide those muscle gains, or where? Because I kind of get lost there.
Mm, yeah, that's a good question, because whenever we're trying to add extra muscle to our body, that in itself is a bit of a stressor. And so there's differences of like, okay, for optimal health, how do we eat? We can kind of listen to our body, stop it satisfied. Optimal health and fitness can sometimes not require the exact same things, because technically pushing our body so much that we need to go into a state of like growing muscle mass beyond what it naturally holds is in itself a stressor. So sometimes we end up needing to like eat a little bit more than feels comfortable, even sometimes, because we have so much that the body needs to repair. But if you're including, like, it's very good to prioritize it, especially if you know you're putting your muscles through that work and you want to give your body the excess that it needs to build muscle. So we have to first make sure the body's getting enough for regular functioning, and then a little bit more than that. But a good way to start is just like try to include protein at every meal and snack. Whereas it's like you could probably maintain a healthy level of protein having it at most meals. But when you're trying to go that little extra mile because you're asking your body to recover from added stresses, you can dial up the protein a little bit because you're putting it to this like next level of stress through harder workouts because you're trying to build muscle mass. And as long as you're like, even if you're just eating normally and having enough that your body, like eating protein at every meal and progressively overloading your weights in the gym and getting stronger in that way, you'd see muscle growth. Don't know if that gave you any extra clarity, but like include it at every meal and each snack, and that'll give you ample, like as long as you're progressively overloading in the gym, increasing your weights each time or increasing your reps each time, then you should see some muscle gain. The thing that throws people off about muscle gain is it takes years and it happens very slowly, so we tend to get frustrated and be like, it's not working. But it just takes a long time. Like, talk to any guy out there, it's like it's tough to put on muscle. Don't, this by no means mean don't do it. It's just know that it takes time, and just because the work you're putting in may feel invisible for a while, you just got to keep going, and you'll see slowly that you'll get stronger and be able to push it more in the gym. But yeah, it's definitely important to make protein a priority, especially when you're putting your body through some extra stress. Yeah. And you'll know, okay, this is actually a better answer to the question. You'll know if you have enough, if you're recovering okay from your workouts. If you do workouts and like every time it's like hard to walk the next day, and you're super freaking sore, then you're not having enough for what you're putting your body through. So that's a good way to judge if you're getting enough or not. It's like, do you feel broken after every workout and it takes 3 days to get back to the gym? Or do you feel a little sore, but you can stay consistent with your workouts? So I'd say that's a more clear answer of how to tell if you're getting enough protein or not. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like me to ramble off on and make it more confusing? I'm the worst person at giving black and white answers because like it's so unique and everyone's metabolism is so different, and where we're at in our mental health is journey makes it different as well. Because I remember when I have arguments with people and they're saying like, no, you should just like never have sugar ever, and I was like, well, when like I would argue there is time when you need to include it, because when I had a binge eating disorder, I needed to go through a healing process with knowing it's okay to eat it and ditching guilt. So it's like in that moment in my life, it was actually the healthier option for me to eat an ice cream and know that it's okay, you know? So depending on where you're at in your life, different things are healthier depending on where you're going and where you're at. But I value your guys' time, and I know it's a random Tuesday night. So thank you guys for jumping on, and hopefully that opens up, you know, a little curiosity in case any other questions come up around that. But I just thought it'd be nice to have a chance to share any extra info. And if you guys have specific questions that you'd like me to open up on other group coaching calls, throw it in the community, and we can build them up from there. So unless there's any other questions or anybody wants to share anything, then you guys are free to enjoy the rest of your night. You guys all good? Yeah? Sweet. Okay, well, thank you guys. It's nice to know that we're all kind of somewhere at the same time. So thanks for hanging out.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.